The envelope looked innocent enough. Cream-colored, thick paper with gold embossed lettering. She pulled it from the mailbox, not expecting it to detonate her entire afternoon. As she walked back to her small porch, the wind whispering through the brittle leaves of late autumn, she turned it over and paused. It wasn't addressed to her. It was for the woman next door. A mistake. But the names inside? They were her sons. Her son and his fiancée. Her son, who hadn't called in 3 months. Her son, whose last message was a half-hearted, "Busy lately, we'll talk soon." Her heart started thudding as she slid her thumb under the seal, the sound of tearing paper oddly loud in the quiet. The invitation was elegant, perfect, everything she'd imagined helping plan for him one day. Except she wasn't in it, not a mention, not even a line about mother of the groom. She stood frozen in her hallway, the invitation trembling in her hands, her breath catching in her throat like it had hit a wall. That evening, after setting the invitation carefully on her table like a relic too dangerous to touch, she opened her laptop. She typed his name into the search bar, fingers stiff, and there it was, a wall of photographs, smiling faces, white dress rehearsals, cake tastings. Her daughter-in-law-to-be beamed at the camera, her arm hooked tightly around her son's. And there, gleaming around her neck, was the heirloom necklace. The same one she had passed down in a quiet moment of trust, whispering, "One day, wear this on a special occasion. Maybe your wedding day." She had imagined being there, brushing back a stray hair, fastening the clasp herself. But in those glossy photos, she was a ghost. A stranger peeking in through the window of a life that had outgrown her. Months ago, she had asked gently, cautiously, if there were any plans. Her son had smiled, distracted. "Nothing set yet, Ma." His fiancée had nodded and offered a tight, polite smile. And then they changed the subject, like her questions were cluttered to be swept off the table. "There was no seat at the table for me," she whispered now, voice dry and small, in the empty room. Just silence, and in that silence, 1,000 unspoken words screamed. She remembered the early mornings before sunrise, when the world was still dark and quiet, and she'd slip on her uniform in the silence, careful not to wake her son sleeping in the next room. After her husband passed, life didn't pause to let her grieve. There were bills, there was rent, there was a growing boy who needed lunch money, and someone to clap the loudest at school plays. So she did what mothers do. She endured. She worked a job at the diner by day and cleaned offices by night. There were years when she lived off instant noodles so he could have the field trip money, the nicer shoes, the tutoring he needed, to chase his dreams. She clipped coupons like currency and skipped birthdays to pay for school supplies. And when he got into college, the pride was so big it drowned out the fear. He'd be the first in their family. She took on a third shift. She paid off his student loans little by little in quiet deposits from her savings jar labeled vacation, a jar she never used for herself. When he met her, the woman who would become his wife, she welcomed her like a daughter. They were just kids then, uncertain but hopeful. When they struggled with money, she opened her home, let them stay in the guest room until you two get on your feet. Months turned into years. She never asked for rent. She cooked for them, did their laundry, and smiled when they called it temporary. When the girl got pregnant, it was a complicated time. Stress, nausea, too many doctor's visits. The girl's own mother wasn't around, so she stepped in without hesitation. Drove her to appointments. Held her hair back when the morning sickness was too much. Rubbed her back and sang the same lullaby she used to hum to her son during his worst fevers. She never asked for thanks. Love, she believed, didn't keep score. When her son said he wanted to propose but couldn't afford a proper ring, she went to the old cedar box she hadn't opened in years. Inside was her grandmother's ring, delicate and beautiful, passed down through generations of women who wore it with pride and pain. She offered it with both hands, heart pounding. "Use this," she said softly. "You'll make it mean something." He took it without hesitation, a wide grin spreading across his face, already picturing the future. She didn't need flowers. That smile was enough. Every sacrifice she made, every meal skipped, every dream delayed, was with one purpose, that her son never feel like he was missing anything, least of all a father. She was mother and father. She played catch in the park, read bedtime stories with different voices, taught him how to shave and how to cry without shame. She showed up at every parent-teacher conference, every award ceremony, every scraped knee with open arms. When he succeeded, she stood in the shadows and clapped the loudest. She never demanded credit, never expected repayment. Her reward was his happiness, his security, his future. But now, as she sat in the same home that once echoed with laughter and late-night footsteps, it felt hollow. Like the memories had moved out with them. She looked at the dining table they once shared and saw only empty chairs. No invitations, no phone calls, no place in the life she helped build. "I didn't just give him a childhood," she whispered to herself, voice thick with the weight of the years. "I gave him my future." And now it felt like she had been erased from it. It was a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary day that didn't prepare you for heartbreak. She had made tea for both of them, hoping for a small moment. Her son was scrolling through his phone, legs casually crossed on the sofa, when she finally asked, lightly, as if the answer didn't matter. "So, how are the wedding plans coming along?" She smiled, tried to make her voice sound breezy, but she already knew the answer. He didn't. "Look up. It's going to be pretty intimate," he said, his tone flat. "Just people who've really been there for us." She froze, just for a second, long enough for the sting to creep under her skin. "Been there for us?" The phrase echoed louder than he realized. She didn't ask what he meant. She just nodded, lips pressed together, the warmth from the teacup suddenly burning her palm. He stood up, kissed her on the head like she was an old woman in a rocking chair, and left for work. The moment passed. But it didn't really. 2 days later, while taking out the trash, she passed by the neighbor's fence and heard giggling. His fiancée was talking to someone on speakerphone. "Oh yeah, we gave her seat to Cheryl, Mom's Pilates instructor. She helped her lose like 15 pounds. Total angel." The laugh that followed cracked something inside her. Cheryl, a woman who had entered their lives through a gym punch card, now had a seat at the table where a mother should have been. She didn't say anything. She didn't rush inside to cry. She just kept walking, the bin bag swinging by her side, the silence inside her deeper than rage. That night, she opened the wedding website. Not out of hope, but to confirm the truth. There was a section called Our Story, filled with curated photos and memories, none of which included her. No mention of the house they had lived in for free. No caption about the heirloom ring. The Meet the Parents section introduced the bride's parents in glowing paragraphs. Below that, only the groom's father was mentioned, a loving tribute to a man long gone, as if he had raised their son alone. Her name wasn't there, not even as a shadow. She clicked through the seating chart, page after page of names. She barely knew. Co-workers, yoga friends, some distant cousins from the bride's side, not hers, nowhere. As if she was a ghost who had wandered into a celebration she was never part of. She tried to talk to her son again. Tried to ask, without accusation, why she was absent from everything. He didn't look at her when he answered. "It's just, I don't know, Mom. You get really emotional sometimes. And this is supposed to be a joyful day. We just didn't want any drama." She felt her knees wobble slightly, like the ground had just shifted a few inches off its axis. Drama? Was it drama to ask why her name had been deleted from her own child's story? To want a seat at the table she helped build? She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't fall apart. She smiled. A small, quiet, almost serene smile. "Of course," she said softly. "I understand." And she walked away, not out of weakness, but because she knew the battle was already over. She had lost without even realizing a war had begun. Later that night, alone in her room, she sat in the dark and traced her finger across the framed photograph on her dresser. A much younger version of herself holding a newborn baby, eyes swollen with exhaustion, but filled with love. A time when she believed love was enough. She closed her eyes and let the silence wrap around her like a blanket of snow. They hadn't cut her out in one clean blow. No, it was slower, more methodical. "They didn't cut me out in one blow," she whispered to the night. "They erased me with 1,000 small lies. Lies wrapped in politeness. Lies sealed with smiles. Lies that looked like love, until they didn't." She tried to keep herself occupied, stacking books that didn't need organizing, dusting already clean picture frames, folding towels too precisely. But silence has a way of crawling into the corners of a house, curling under doors, seeping in through cracks in the window. On a whim, she dialed her sister, a familiar number she had called 1,000 times. The line rang, then clicked. Voicemail. "Hi, it's me," she said, voice faltering halfway. "I just wanted to talk." She hung up before the beep. She waited for a callback that never came. The next morning, she ran into her neighbor while trimming the hedge. The woman, cheerful as ever, asked about the wedding. When she admitted she wasn't attending, there was a long pause. Then, with a nervous smile, the neighbor said, "Oh, well, maybe they're just busy, you know?" The word stung more than intended. Busy. As if an entire erasure could be softened by a calendar excuse. She watched the world from her window as if she'd been locked out of her own life. People came and went, laughter in the streets, the sun, rising and setting like nothing had changed. Online, the bachelorette party photos exploded across her feed. Glittering dresses, champagne flutes, group hugs. Her son stood in the back of one, grinning beside his fiancée as pink confetti floated around them. Dozens of comments poured in. "You two are glowing. So proud of you both. A match made in heaven." Not one person noticed her absence. Not one aunt or cousin messaged to ask where she was. It was as if she'd never existed in their story. As if motherhood, sacrifice, presence, all of it, had been deleted with the swipe of a filter. Days passed. The wedding day arrived, not with ceremony, but with a dull ache that settled in her chest like a stone. There were no phone calls, no accidental texts, no taxi horns outside her house, just the stillness of a morning that felt too quiet for something so monumental. She made toast, the dry kind with no butter, and sat by the window in her robe. A car honked in the distance. Somewhere, far off, church bells rang faintly. She didn't cry. She just watched. That evening, the sky began to pulse with color. Gold, red, white, shimmering arcs over the trees. Fireworks. The reception was only a few blocks away. She could almost make out the shape of the tent, hear the distant hum of music, the rise of laughter. She took another bite of cold toast and stared at the glowing sky. It wasn't the silence that broke her. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was the realization that no one, not one person, had noticed she was missing. That in a room full of family, full of speeches and champagne, her name wasn't mentioned. Her face didn't cross their minds. No one looked around and thought, "Where is she?" The invisibility was complete, and as the fireworks faded into smoke, as the celebration dwindled into the low hum of post-party exhaustion, she sat in the dark, her plate untouched, her phone quiet, her heart strangely still. The silence wasn't the worst part, she whispered, not to anyone, but to herself. It was realizing no one even missed me. She had avoided the drawer for years, the old filing cabinet tucked behind the hallway coats, filled with yellowing documents and memories that smelled like dust and time. But tonight, she needed to feel like something still belonged to her. It had started with the idea of a will, a quiet thought that had crept in sometime between the wedding silence and the fireworks. If she didn't matter to them now, at least, she could make sure what remained of her life was sorted. She pulled open the drawer and sifted through tax forms, report cards, greeting cards from birthdays long past. That's when she saw it, the envelope thick with legal print, brittle, at the corners. The deed to the house. Her house. And not a single name on it but her own. Her hand trembled as she reread it, twice, 3 times. They had talked once about maybe putting it in both names, she remembered, back when they had moved in and started treating it like their own. But it had never happened. Somewhere between the begging and the bills, she had forgotten to follow up. And so the house, the roof under which they'd built their perfect little future, was still hers. Entirely, legally hers. It was like oxygen flooding her lungs after too long underwater. She leaned back, stunned. The walls felt different now, less like a prison, more like a fortress. On a hunch, she dug deeper into the files. She found the equity loan statement, the one she had signed without much reading, trusting her sons. Assurance that it's just a technical thing, Ma. They needed the money for something, a down payment, he said. Turns out it helped pay for their honeymoon. She recognized the number. She saw the dates. She felt the betrayal bloom again. But this time, it didn't sting the same. It clarified. The next morning, she visited Mr. Abdul, a longtime family friend and semi-retired lawyer who still kept a small office above a corner pharmacy. He looked through the papers with his glasses low on his nose, eyebrows lifting as he scanned the documents. You still own everything, he said plainly. They used your name, your credit, but your ownership, intact. He paused. And the necklace? There's no transfer, no legal gift. It's still yours by law. She stared at him. Even though he proposed with it? Doesn't matter. It was lent, not given. He tapped the edge of the desk. You still have rights. On her way home, she remembered something else. A savings account she had opened the week her son was born. Back then, she had set aside $20 a month, dreaming of a future where he could go to school, start a business, do something extraordinary. She'd never touched it after his graduation, thinking he'd outgrown needing her help. At the bank, she requested the statement. The balance was more than she expected, untouched, still registered in her name. The irony twisted in her chest. All these years, she had held value they never cared to ask about, because they never imagined she still held any power. By the time she walked back through her front door, the air felt different. Not because they were gone, but because she was finally present, fully, consciously present. The sorrow hadn't left her. It still curled at the edge of her chest like smoke. But something else had risen from its ashes. Clarity. They had written her out, closed the door gently behind her, and danced in the room she had built with her bare hands. But they hadn't checked the locks. They hadn't noticed the foundation still bore her name. They wanted her erased, but they forgot the eraser doesn't own the paper. She sat by the window as the light shifted through the curtains and allowed herself a small, knowing smile. They thought they had won. They thought she was alone, powerless, discarded. But they were wrong. They wanted me gone, she said quietly, feeling the words settle into something stronger than grief. But they forgot who built the ground. They stand on. And with that, she closed the drawer, stood up, and began to reclaim what had never stopped being hers. She moved with quiet purpose, each step no longer weighed down by grief, but lifted by resolve. The visit to Mr. Abdul's office wasn't emotional. It was business. She arrived with a small folder in hand and left with a new trust in place, one that safeguarded everything she still owned. The house, the savings account, even the modest pension she'd planned to someday leave behind. Her will was rewritten with precision, her assets secured for the causes and people who had truly shown up, not just with smiles, but with substance. There would be no courtroom battles after she was gone. There would be no confusion. Everything would be in writing, everything clear. Her son and his bride would not inherit a single brick of the home they had once walked through like entitled guests. Not unless they decided to show up as people again, not vultures. Next was the necklace, the one she had handed over so willingly, believing it would be worn with pride and remembered with gratitude. She returned to it now not as a sentimental keepsake, but as property, one never legally gifted, only loaned. A local jeweler examined it under bright light and sharp tools, appraising it not just for monetary value, but for heritage. She brought the official report with her, along with the notarized statement she had the lawyer draft. Item was temporarily loaned, not gifted, and remains the property of the undersigned. There would be no fight, only facts. She had no need to raise her voice, not when paper spoke louder and lasted longer. She spent the next day crafting a gift. Not the kind wrapped in ribbon to be torn open in joy, but one that would sit on a table and crack the air with silence. A beautifully wrapped box, weighty and elegant, with soft ivory paper and a bow that shimmered just enough to look expensive. Inside, she placed the original equity loan paperwork, highlighting her signature beside the funding line for their honeymoon. Next came the deed to the house, copies stamped and legal, showing her name alone at the top. The appraisal report for the necklace, the bank statement for the untouched account. And finally, a polite legal letter, professionally worded, utterly calm. It explained that the assets in question remained hers, and any assumptions otherwise were incorrect and unsupported by law. There was no anger in the wording, no bitterness in the phrasing, just precision, just truth. She sent the box with a courier scheduled to arrive midway through the wedding reception. Not at the altar, not to spoil the ceremony, just after the vows, when the music swelled and they thought the past had been fully buried. The timing was deliberate. She didn't want to ruin their day. She wanted to remind them whose shoulders they had climbed on and who still stood quietly at the foundation. It was never about revenge. It was about recognition, not from them, but from herself. Because in truth, she didn't need a seat at their table anymore. She wasn't hungry for their approval. She had starved herself for their comfort long enough. She had given the best parts of her life away, only to be treated like a relic, but not anymore. As she stood in her kitchen that night, the silence around her was different. No longer the hollow silence of abandonment, but the kind that comes with peace. She lit a candle, not for mourning, but for illumination. She brewed tea not as a distraction, but as a ritual. For the first time in a long while, she was living for herself. No applause, no thank yous, just steady breaths and steady ground. I didn't need a seat at their table, she thought, sipping slowly. I built my own, on solid ground. And on that ground, she would stand alone. Not lonely, whole. The music swelled, glasses clinked, and laughter floated through. The lavish reception hall as guests raised their phones to catch every perfect moment. The bride beamed, radiant in her second gown of the night, while the groom smiled dutifully for the cameras, though a sheen of nervousness flickered around his edges. A table near the front bore the gifts, wrapped in golds and silvers, bows artfully arranged. But one stood out, elegant, understated, wrapped in ivory with no name on the outside, just a small card. To the newlyweds. It was opened almost casually at first, like the others, tissue paper lifted, lid removed. But the moment the groom saw the papers inside, his smile faltered. He pulled them out slowly, recognition dawning as his hands began to shake. Page by page, the truth surfaced. Legal notices, ownership revocations, a bank statement, a notarized appraisal. And at the top of it all, a letter signed in quiet authority by Mr. Abdul himself. He stopped reading aloud halfway through. The room fell silent, the kind of hush that swallows laughter and freezes movement. Someone leaned in to whisper. Others pretended not to notice. The bride leaned over his shoulder, read a few lines, and then staggered back, eyes wide with horror. Her perfectly set mouth crumpled as the realization hit. The house they called theirs was not. The necklace on her throat was contested. The money they'd spent? Not a gift, a debt. One of the groomsmen reached for the box, confused, until the bride slammed it shut with shaking hands. Her sobs broke the fragile air as she fled the table. Someone recorded it. Of course they did. Within hours, a clip surfaced online. The bride storming out, mascara streaking, while confused guests whispered behind her. "Who does this on a wedding day?" the caption read. Comments exploded with speculation. Some called it cruel. Others whispered admiration. But only a few asked the right question. What did they do to deserve it? Back at home, she didn't check her phone. She didn't scroll through trending hashtags or watch the clips passed between distant relatives. She didn't need to. Her intention had never been to go viral. It had been to reclaim what was hers, her voice, her name, her legacy. She didn't crash their party. She didn't raise her voice. She simply told the truth, and she told it in writing. They were the ones who made the lie public. They were the ones who built their life on unspoken debts and silent betrayals, never expecting those silences to speak back. By the time the bride's mother was calling her a monster behind clenched teeth, by the time her son was texting, her in disbelief, not to apologize, but to demand an explanation, she was making dinner. Nothing fancy, just something warm, nourishing, for herself. The house was quiet, but not empty. It was hers. Every wall, every floorboard, every window that once held the silhouettes of the people who thought they had buried her beneath gratitude, still stood firm under her name. They tried to shame me in silence, she thought, watching the kettle. Steam. I answered with dignity and consequences. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. For too long she had swallowed her voice so others could feel full. For too long she had smiled through wounds and whispered through injustice. But silence isn't noble when it's forced, and kindness without boundaries isn't love. It's self-erasure. So she wrote her boundaries in ink. She laced her kindness with law. And when the world asked why she had ruined a perfect day, she didn't answer. Because she hadn't. They had. All she did was take back what was hers. It didn't take long. Just 2 days after the wedding, they came back, suitcases in tow, faces taut with frustration, masked as confusion. The front gate creaked open, but the key didn't fit. He tried again. Nothing. He rattled the handle like the house owed him. Something like the door might remember him and open out of habit. But the locks had been changed, professionally, legally, and without apology. Through the living room window, she watched them stand there in stunned silence. The bride glanced around as if hoping someone would appear with answers, as if this must be a mistake. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, he returned alone, a grocery bouquet in one hand, a paper bag in the other, maybe pastries, maybe peace offerings. He knocked gently, a sound she once would have hurried to. Answer. She stood behind the door, just inches away, her fingers resting on the handle. She waited, not out of hesitation, but to remind herself that this was real. Then she opened the door just enough to see his eyes. They were soft, uncertain, filled with a boyish hope that used to move her, but not anymore. "Ma, please, can we talk?" he asked, voice low. She looked at the flowers, then back at him. the silence between them louder than fireworks. "No," she said quietly, and she closed the door. The days that followed brought whispers. Relatives who had posted congratulatory photos now sent cautious texts. "I didn't know they treated you like that. If I'd known, I would have said something." She ignored most of them, but a few reached her, the ones who said it plainly. "You deserved better." And they were right. The bride's family, once so proud, so smug, now burned with embarrassment. Their daughter had married into a scandal, not a public one, but worse, a silent one, hard to explain and harder to justify. There were awkward dinners, forced smiles, quiet blame passed in passive-aggressive comments. Her name came up in hushed voices and heavy sighs. Meanwhile, she cooked. She didn't throw a party or gloat. She simply prepared a meal the way she always had, with care, with warmth, with the intention to nourish. She invited a few neighbors, the ones who had always looked out for her in small, sincere ways. The ones who noticed when her porch light stayed off too long. They sat at her table, laughed softly, passed bowls of warm rice and spiced lentils. The house, once a shell of echoing absence, felt full again, not with people who took, but with those who gave quietly. They didn't ask what happened. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. The laughter was easy, the night simple. And for the first time in a long time, she ate without feeling like she was stealing space from someone else's celebration. Later, as she washed the dishes by hand, warm water running over her fingers, she looked out the kitchen window at the teal moonlight on the garden. It was still her garden, still her home, still her life. And though it had been bruised, carved through by betrayal, it remained intact. She had survived not just being forgotten, but being discarded. And she had done so without screaming, without begging, without becoming the villain they had expected her to be. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't something she had to give just because they remembered her again. Some things didn't deserve to be forgiven. Some things needed to be remembered, not erased. "Forgiveness isn't owed to those who buried you alive," she whispered to herself, drying her hands with a towel. And with that, she turned off the kitchen light and let the quiet peace of her own company wrap around her like a soft, earned silence. The photo albums sat untouched for years, tucked away in the back of her bedroom closet, collecting dust alongside forgotten winter coats and unused candles. She had once thought opening them would break her, that seeing his childhood smiles, or the way he used to cling to her leg when scared, would feel like pouring salt on fresh wounds. But now, on a quiet Sunday morning, with sunlight stretching across, her kitchen floor and tea steeping beside her, she pulled the first album from its shelf. Carefully, page by page, she began to look, really look, for the first time in years. And what she saw wasn't a woman who had been left behind. It wasn't a mother who had failed. It was a woman who had carried generations forward on her shoulders. There she was in every frame, holding scraped knees, balancing rent payments, with birthday cakes, piecing together magic from nothing. She hadn't just raised a child. She'd built a bridge between past and future, one sacrifice at a time, and somewhere along the way she had mistaken that strength for burden. But now she knew better. That week, she walked into a local shelter and signed up to volunteer. The paperwork felt official, the ink final, but her steps were light as she began anew. She folded blankets, handed out meals, sat beside women with stories not unlike her own, women who had loved too much and been loved too little. Their conversations were gentle, raw, healing. She didn't need to be a mother to belong. She didn't need titles or photos on a wedding website. She only needed honesty and the freedom to be seen without being used. There, in the small moments of giving without expectation, she felt herself slowly return. One afternoon after her shift, she passed by a music shop she'd always admired but never entered. In the window stood a piano, upright, cherry wood, glowing faintly in the late sun. She had always wanted to learn, had imagined it once as a retirement dream long postponed by responsibility. That day, she stepped inside and bought it. Not for show, not for anyone else, just for the pure joy of giving herself something beautiful, something impractical, something hers. A week later, she booked a cruise, a quiet one, not the party kind, but the kind where the ocean stretches like silence and each sunset feels like a prayer answered in color. And before the month was out, she brought home a rescue dog, small, scrappy, all ears and no manners. He followed her from room to room like a shadow made of joy. At night, the house was no longer filled with ghosts. It pulsed with music, laughter from sitcom reruns, the gentle clatter of dog nails on hardwood. She cooked for herself, danced in. The kitchen, burned candles just because. Her joy wasn't loud, it wasn't performative. It was quiet and warm and rooted. And somewhere between the piano keys and paw prints, she began to understand the ache that had lived in her chest for so long wasn't just about being left behind. It was about how deeply she had tried to stay needed, how hard she had worked to earn a space that should have been hers without question. "I thought I was grieving them," she whispered one night as she held a photo of her younger self, smiling, tired, brave. But I was mourning the version of myself that begged to belong. And now finally that version could rest, because she no longer needed to ask for a seat. She had built her own sanctuary, and it was enough. The kitchen was quiet, the kind of stillness that used to echo with voices, footsteps, rushed mornings, and late-night tears. But tonight, there was no rush, no obligation, just the soft hum of the oven and the rhythmic chop of vegetables beneath her steady hands. She wasn't cooking to impress anyone, wasn't accommodating preferences or allergies, wasn't adjusting recipes to stretch leftovers. She cooked for herself, slowly, deliberately, lovingly. The scent of garlic and rosemary filled the air, dancing gently with the soft piano music playing in the background, the keys echoing lightly from the corner where her new piano sat. On the counter, she had laid out the good dishes, the ones wrapped in tissue paper and buried at the back of the cabinet for decades, always for special occasions. Tonight, the occasion was her own existence. She set the table for one, a single plate, polished silverware, a crystal glass of water catching the gold of the setting sun. No candles, no centerpiece, just simplicity, just space. She plated the meal with care, arranging everything with the same thoughtfulness she once reserved for guests who barely remembered to say thank you. And when everything was ready, she walked over to the window and sat down. The chair didn't creak the way it used to. Maybe it was lighter now. Maybe so was she. Outside, the sky was a soft watercolor of peach and lavender. Birds flitted between branches, and the neighbor's wind chime tapped out a delicate tune that reminded her of lullabies. She didn't take a photo. She didn't text anyone about it. There was no one to impress. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to be seen to feel real. She didn't scroll. She didn't wait. She just picked up her fork and began to eat. Every bite was a quiet revolution. Not because the food was perfect, though it was, but because it belonged entirely to her. The ingredients, the time, the space, all hers. She didn't think about who wasn't there. She didn't wonder what they were doing, if they missed her, if they regretted anything. That chapter had closed. She had mourned enough, carried enough, questioned herself into the ground. Now the ground was hers, solid, unshakable, and she wasn't afraid to stand on it alone. Her dog curled at her feet, letting out a small sigh that mirrored her own. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt honest. Every corner, every quiet room, every photo frame she chose to keep, they were filled with truth. Her truth. Not the curated one they once used when it was convenient to include her. This one was raw and real and hers, and in that truth, She had found the kind of peace no apology could give her. She looked around the table, clean, serene, glowing in the last light of the day, and without sadness, without longing, without the ache of waiting for someone else to join her, she smiled. It wasn't the smile she used to wear for comfort or politeness. It was soft, rooted, free. This wasn't loneliness. This was solitude. And there's a difference, one she had fought through years of silence and betrayal to finally understand. She had fed everyone else's hunger until her own became a whisper. Tonight, she listened to that whisper. And it told her she had always been enough. This time, she didn't eat standing at the counter while others took the best pieces. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't pretend she wasn't hungry. She didn't fold herself into the background. This time, she ate at her table, alone and free.